ISO 14001:2015 has been the backbone of environmental management for years, helping organisations systematically reduce their environmental impact. Now, with the latest amendments, new elements are being introduced to ensure businesses are ready for the evolving challenges of climate change, supply chain responsibility, and resilience. This week, we're going to dive into ISO 14001:2015 is changing. Are you ready? And we're going to explore what's new with this and what's staying the same and what organisations need to do to future-proof their environmental management systems. Welcome to Lead the Standard. Hello, welcome. I am Kelly Taylor. As always, thrilled to have you join myself and Jackie for today's conversation. Hi, Jackie.
Hello.
Now, this one we've had a few conversations about this week. While it's not quite a full revision of 14,001, the amendments are significant. So much so that many auditors and environmental professionals are questioning how these changes will affect their work. And for anyone listening along today, watching along, if you'd like to explore this topic further, you can find links to the newsletter we've based today's episode on in the show notes, as well as any other links that we talk about today. So to the amendments, et cetera, et cetera. It really is worth the read. Was
that sarcasm?
I'm going to be honest. I'm learning a lot about myself over the last couple of weeks, and it's become a bit of a situation of you don't know what you know. And yeah, it has been quite interesting. As even just the last couple of days, we've been talking about 14,001 particularly and what those changes mean. So, and how these changes are going to differ from what we talked about last week with what we expect for 9,001. Now, you yourself have been auditing 14,001 for a couple of years. We'll call it time. But I read the article yesterday when it came out, and I was quite surprised to see that you had a moment of doubt when looking at these amendments. And I loved that your honesty in that, as well as you've mentioned, quite a few people in not just the auditing space, but in the environment in general are questioning things. So can you share with us what initially stood out to you and why you feel that this update feels different to both as a quality last week, but the last revision of 14,000?
Yeah, it is a bit, I think overall it's a bit confusing out there at the moment because it is an amendment. And if you do a Google search on ISO 14,001 amendment even, you'll find articles from other third parties saying there's a new revision. But I've done my research, and there's one source of the truth, that's you're saying, Kelly, and it comes from ISO.org. And on ISO.org, they I suppose visualize and demonstrate, show people where the revisions and amendments are at. So with 14,001:2015, if you go and have a look, this is definitely, it's amendment number 2.
Yeah.
Okay, because amendment 1 was climate change amendments, which was February 2024, and now this is amendment number 2. So, and then in comparison, if you go and look at 9,001:2015, it's definitely new revision. Like there's a whole extra block there on the ISO website that says a new revision is due out next year. So I'm not saying I'm right, but I'm just sharing that at this point, looking at ISO as my source of truth, it is an amendment. Okay. It's a massive amendment though, so that's why, I sort of get why people think or are saying it's a new revision. And look, if anyone from ISO is listening or reading, please give us some more information to help with the confusion out there. But even the document, and I've actually got that
Mine
open.
open too, yeah.
Yeah, like it says draft amendment and DAM 2, amendment 2. It does not say it's a new revision. So we can't, like, we have to base the truth on these documents from ISO. So just be careful when you're reading other third parties' articles, because I was confused, possibly other people are confused, and we're jumping to conclusions that because the amendment is so huge, like my first question was, well, why isn't this a new revision? Why are they treating it as an amendment? And they may very well decide after this draft that it will be a new revision.
Yeah.
And maybe there's some people out there that know more than me or have access to information I don't, and access to information that ISO's not even sharing yet.
Yeah.
So
feedback is great for these sorts of things, isn't it? If everyone's confused already at this level, then you would think that that might be a little bit of a driver, particularly when a lot of what's in the amendment simply says replace.
Yeah, and there's some addition. There are, like, I'm looking at one now, add the following note, add the following new paragraph.
It just feels like this is their storyboard almost.
Yeah, why is it an amendment?
Yeah, it feels like a storyboard.
Yeah, and look, it's very clear in the amendment document, because it's, as you said, this is what it currently, replace this paragraph with this one, or add the following new paragraph.
Yeah.
So, but it's huge. There's a lot of change in it.
Yeah.
And look, it might just be some tweaking of words, but I did notice there was a subclause change, 6.1.
Right.
Yeah, 6.1.4 is now 6.1.5. Planning action. So it's its own. So yeah, there are actually some structure changes as well, which it also makes me question, why isn't this a new revision? I don't get it. But at this point we have draft amendment 2. So that's what we're sharing. That's the information that we're sharing in here, that it is a draft amendment. So that's what I've written the article to as well. And look, probably something I did realize, similar to 9001, which we talked about last week, which is actually a new revision. There are changes in it, but it's more about emphasizing sort of what's already there.
Yeah.
And I think this is similar.
Yeah, at a quick glance, before I let you get into your short answer, look, we've been talking about this because obviously we deliver this as a course, and we need to figure out how to deliver this amendment. It is very, very clear, but it is very unclear that there is an amendment if you are purchasing a new standard and those things, which I found quite, and I tried to purchase this through a couple of different channels, and I found that confusing. And that was just the first amendment with 2 little notes added. So, yeah, I'm curious to see, look, at the risk.
Can you share that experience with people? Because if people are going to purchase the standards.
Absolutely.
And this is, I know 14,001 is a great example, but it applies to any standard that's had an amendment.
Yeah. So we were testing to find out what's the best way that we can share this information with not only our students, but the wider community, which is why we're here. And the challenge I had was when any of the sites that I used to purchase a copy of a standard that had an amendment, and there was quite a few that had that clause 4.1, 4.2 amendment in February of last year. When you go to purchase those standards today, you are purchasing the original standard. Not one of those places that I went to purchase from told me that there was an amendment to that I needed to add to my cart or that I needed to consider in that process until well after the purchase stage. And even then, there was a tiny little note that said update available. And then when I went to that update, then I was prompted to download the amendment separately. So that's a lesson that we've learned, particularly for any new standards that we're going to be delivering, is that we need to be really conscious of that whole trail. An amendment is a separate document that's added later on. And when you're purchasing a standard, no matter which one it is, always double check that amendment chain to make sure that you are picking that up. I was quite surprised given that these people work in an industry of standards, and these are the international standards and guidelines and requirements. And they weren't telling you that they had changed those goalposts until after the fact. They were free, thankfully, but it was unclear that what I had purchased, downloaded, had a change. If I wasn't in the position that I am and knew that that was the case, I could have been in a spot of bother, we'll call it. So this is why when I'm looking at this, I'm really hoping that ISO hear all of the alarm bells going off in people's heads and go, actually, let's just do a whole new revision, because it is a lot. It is great, and that's why I'm keen to talk about it, but it's a lot. And I love
absolutely.
So you want to share about how you've been thinking about an EMS?
Okay. This is a shortcut into Jackie's brain. And I always try and align it with the topic. That's why I think the model with this in the newsletter was an umbrella. I don't know.
Very fitting for today's
climate
weather.
change, it makes sense. I think we had a food one, used a fishbone diagram. So you've sort of got to align it in your brain. So when I was pulling this together, I thought, okay, think of your EMS, so your environmental management system, like an umbrella. And at this point in time, because you've got that structured framework already from the 2015 revision. Okay, so that framework manages your environmental responsibilities. It keeps your business organisation on track and protected, I guess. With the latest amendment, so Amendment 2, it does, as we've been discussing, introduce several, maybe that's an understatement, quite a lot of updates. So, and as I mentioned before, it sort of reflects to me maybe just a stronger emphasis on things, not like complete changes. So just a stronger emphasis on those climate related risks, which came into play in February 2024 in the First Amendment anyway. And of course, 14,001 has always had life cycle thinking, but it was only ever in one clause, which I think was in clause 8.1. It was the only place it was mentioned, but now it's sort of mentioned a lot more throughout the standards, because life cycle thinking, goes into those climate related risks in general, your environmental aspects. So using those, I think it's just a greater or stronger emphasis on those few areas. So there are, as we said, there's quite a lot of refinements is a good word across the standard. But I've sort of chosen, I think, to focus on what stands out more to me. I don't want to go through every single clause and say, replace this with this. I might share some examples, but if you want more of that, just read the article, and that might change too. I do think at the end of the newsletter there is a bit of a disclaimer, because it might change. I'm just basing this on the draft, and as everyone knows, drafts change. So yeah, I've just, I suppose, categorized, I think it's into 3 areas. using the approach that, okay, you've got your framework, that's your umbrella, and now there's a few different categories just to consider. And those different categories might fall into several clauses. So the three categories I put under the umbrella were the climate change considerations. Okay, so there's a lot more emphasis on that since the 2024 amendment. As I said, the life cycle thinking, including the supply chain as well, and then risk management. And I know all three of them have always been there. Okay, but these are the three main things I see that stronger emphasis around. So they're the ones that, yeah, I'd like to focus on, and what I did focus on in the newsletter.
Yeah.
So did you want me to continue, Kelly?
Yeah, let's jump straight in, because I've got the first couple of clauses up in front of me, and there are some interesting little tweaks in that as well. So let's go.
Okay, no, that's good, because I've got it on up too, so I might be flicking between and trying to pick it up. So the first significant shift, I suppose that's a good way of putting it, that falls under, oh, this is funny too. I named that umbrella model the EMS stormproof model. Sorry, I'm just laughing at my own.
I don't know how stormproof umbrellas have been of late, but let's get.
No, that's true.
This is much more resilient model than a typical umbrella. So
true, it is a very strong umbrella. Yeah. So the first significant shift that falls under the EMS stormproof model is climate change considerations. Okay, so I have picked a few clauses out. As I said, I'm not going to go right into them, but we do sort of see these climate change considerations, as we all know, in 4.1 and 4.2. They actually came out last year, 2024, but they're also sort of within 5.2 as well as 6.1.2. So 5.2 is your policy, and 6.1.2 is what I think the core of any 14,001 system is, your environmental aspects. So you'll see that, and I'm just going to quickly summarize now in 4.1, whereas before the previous amendment was just consider climate change, impacts or influences. Now it's a bit more detail, and it says that these issues shall include environmental conditions being affected by the organisation or capable of affecting the organisation. And they give some examples like pollution levels, natural resources, climate change, biological diversity, or ecosystem health. So, and then it refers to Annex A as well. So there'll be a bit more information in Annex A. So you can see even in that, this is the frustration that we had in February 2024 when the climate change amendments came out. They just added one little sentence to 4.1 and one little sentence to 4.2, and there was no guidance as to what does this mean? What does this look like? So we were sort of going blind.
Yeah. I'm just going to quickly interrupt while you're talking about 4.1 and 4.2. It said, I've got it up here. It does say to replace the whole subclause, and it says replace and writes the words with this. I note that it doesn't mention the previous amendment anywhere in there as to whether that is removed or replaced or retained, even though that's built in kind of to the wording. So my first question is, are we removing that note? Are we keeping that note? So there's all of these little things, because you're right. This previously it just said consider climate change. Ta-da. Now it does give you some better insights, but it doesn't have any reference to the previous amendments. So again, something we need to be mindful of when we're looking at these revisions. They're not necessarily keeping each other in that. And same for 4.2, replace C with C and add another note, but it doesn't stipulate anything.
I would say, because as you found when you purchase a new standard, you purchase the original. So obviously, particularly 4.1, replace entire subclause. I would say that that first amendment will be superseded, because it wouldn't make sense if we just had that because they include climate change in that last paragraph already.
And then for 4.2, it says at the end, add the following note, which is the same as what we've added to 4.1. Again, picks up climate change.
Yeah.
Use that to replace it. So these are the sorts of things that when we're
Yeah.
reading through these documents, we need to be aware of. Yeah, do we just ignore Amendment 1 and run with Amendment 2? Or do we amendment the draft? We have the original plus Amendment 1 plus Amendment 2 plus Amendment 3. So it was my first
It's it's
moment.
an interesting situation, isn't it?
Let's hope it
Because as you said, in 4.2, they also have extended it, and they've actually got that in a note that relevant interested parties can have needs and expectations related to environmental conditions, pollution levels, natural resources, climate change, biological diversity, or ecosystem health. So they've sort of expanded it on it. Well, that's probably a good word. They've expanded on the original Amendment 1 in both clause 4.1 and 4.2 with this. So it does give us a little bit more to play with, you know, as implementers or auditors, I guess. So yeah, I would say it overrides Amendment 1, which is really weird because when you purchase it, you get Amendment 1 and Amendment 2 at the same time. Anyway, this is all very new. I haven't experienced this, you know, 2 amendments after each other before. So
I'm going to let you keep working through. I'm going to have a quick squeeze in here, pardon my Aussieisms, and see if there is any reference to how that works while you're talking through the rest of your thing.
Okay.
I can
because I think there's only another couple. Yeah. And I promised I wouldn't dwell on clauses, and I won't, but just quickly, clause 5.2, which is your environmental policy, there is now an extra note as well about protecting the environment, and it gives us some more context around natural resources, sustainable resource use, again, climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and again, mentioning biodiversity and ecosystem. So again, it goes into a lot more detail. And then the last clause I found this emphasis on climate change was in 6.1.2. Again, there's a new note. And this specifically talks about a life cycle perspective as well, bringing in those environmental aspects, because that's the main, I think 6.1.2 is the really core clause to anything you do past this point. And it actually at this point gives you examples of what life cycle stages are, right from acquisition of the raw materials, design, production, transport, delivery, use, end of life, treatment, and then of course the final disposal. And then there also is something new, I think, that talks about determining the potential emergency situations. And I've always talked about that in this section, either 6.1.1 or 6.1.2, because this is the opportunity where you will identify, what potentially could go wrong. So they seem to emphasize that. So I suppose overall, it's just giving organizations a lot more context as to what they need to consider when they're developing, maintaining, updating their system. It gives us a lot more context, I guess, something to work with, some prompts essentially. So I know in the newsletter we included, an example application. So with this one, look, these example applications obviously are very generic and there's other influences, but as an example, I used a manufacturing company for this climate change emphasis, I guess. Like that might look like committing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and with that commitment and intent, you might see that in their environmental policy. So you can see that additional commitment. They might look at their supply chain and how vulnerable it is to climate risks and influences. So, whether their supply chain is impacted by extreme weather, which in turn impacts resource, so raw material shortage as well. And then, of course, they're already doing risk assessments. So have they included, or they should be integrating, these climate strategies into their risk assessments. So as implementers or people maintaining an EMS and as auditors, that's sort of what you're looking for, this greater emphasis. It should stand out more and not sort of just be an afterthought. So, and unfortunately, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say this, normally, and this is sort of a common discussion I have, where, it's health, HSE, health, safety, environment, QHSE, and we sort of all joke, and it's not a laughing matter, that E just sort of gets tagged on at the end. I think now with these amendments, E's just not tagged on at the end.
No.
There's a lot more to it, and it's going to have its time in the sun, literally. Yeah.
I would love some sunshine right now. I am sick of the rain. Look,
Yes,
great. My tank is full, but that's all that. But yeah, I agree. I've always, when we've been building content and having discussions, environment does kind of get left behind, and environment seems to be the course that people kind of go, oh, if I have to, or I want quality, or I want environment is always an afterthought. But I also note that it was much broader. There was less, as you said, a lot less context compared to the other standards. It was shorter, it was smaller. And I think people are really starting to think or see, with everything that's going on in the world at the moment, how much of an impact environment has on everything else. It's no longer just we're living in this world and it will be here forever. We're starting to see, things that haven't happened in places before suddenly are, and that's because of the impact we as individuals and organizations have been having. And this is really really bringing that to the forefront. What I've found interesting in those is there's a lot of additions in those couple of little ones, but it is a lot more even the little wording around being aware of the word I'm after. I just had a complete blank then. I'll come back to that. Sorry, I will. I'll come back while I'll get this other thought out of my head. To answer the question about before, there is nothing in either the draft amendment or the ISO site that states that Amendment 2 will supersede Amendment 1 or anything like that. I did find on the ISO site, when you are looking at the life cycle of the standard, it does say the amendments provide additional content available for purchase, not included in the text of the existing standard. But that's only on that page. It's not included in that purchase process for any.
Yeah.
So be aware of that. Sorry, where I was going back to the clauses you were talking about. It isn't just around looking at, they refers a lot to the risks, opportunities, threats before, but it does have kind of that wider scope around what's going to happen after the fact. So it's kind of almost leaning into an OH&S, handing over to an OH&S thing much more clearly than it has before. It is really well aligned in that space.
And I suppose I was going to say, well, there's always been certain elements that integrate. Absolutely. But then as we're discussing these amendments in Amendment 2, there's nothing completely brand new. No. Like climate change came out 23rd of February 2024 in the First Amendment. Yeah. So, climate change is not a new thing. There's just a greater emphasis on it.
And more context.
Okay, there's more information and more context. Yeah. Okay, so then that's what, because of that, I think that's where you were heading, Kelly, is you can see the integration a lot more with OH&S.
Yeah.
There's,
that's going to common people.
Yeah. I sort of like it. And I was thinking that just while you were sharing, like while I write these first, I always find it actually a lot it's a lot better to talk it through with someone else, because I'm sitting here having a chat with myself, and you sort of, you see it, I suppose, is it 2D, just,
Yeah.
and then when you talk with someone, you see it 3D. And we've had this a few times when we've been talking about these newsletters in the podcast. It's like, oh, hold on a second. And sometimes you might reorder things or change it a bit, because, and I'm going off on a tangent now. That's why it's good to talk about these things. I'll share a funny story, because this is something. I got a newsletter yesterday from a certification body, and someone, I don't know who, had written this block of text. So as auditors, how we are to, what we're looking for in clause 4.1 and 4.2, the first amendment. And I'm reading it and thinking, are you for real? Like, it's almost like an environmental scientist had written it. We're just looking at the system, and they had us looking at data. And I took a screenshot and sent it to an auditor friend of mine who we like keeping things simple. We understand our place in the world, and we're about the system, the framework. The environmental scientists are about the technical stuff. Yes, we need a little bit of that understanding, but that's not what we do. And I sent it to him and I said, this is ridiculous. It's over the top. Who in a systems world knows what on earth this person's talking about? And what scares me is that they're sharing that with other auditors. And my other auditor mate said, yeah, that is absolutely ridiculous. And he said, I didn't write it. I said, no.
Honestly, when you said it was a funny story, I thought you were going to say that he said, well, actually, I wrote that. So...
No, I knew he wouldn't have been the one to write it. That's why I shared it with him.
Yeah.
Because whenever we talk about the three standards we work in, it is about keeping it simple and streamlined, and we understand our lane, I guess. So as ISO auditors, ours is about the system and the framework. And then particularly in OH&S and environment, because then we have this amazing layer of people that are more in the technical and legislative world. So they're the ones that, in clause 8 specifically, really step in, and, their knowledge comes into play from that operational and technical world. So, I've said this before, as auditors, we don't raise non-conformances against legislation. That's out of scope. I suppose that's a good word. We need to stay in our swim lane, which is our scope, and understand what the standard is actually telling us.
Speaking of scope, do you want to move on to the second shift?
Yes. Thank you. The second significant shift that falls under the EMS Stormproof model, my umbrella, is that life cycle thinking, which brings into it the supply chain. And again, as I said before, life cycle thinking has always been in there. I believe that it was mentioned in clause 8.1 in the original. But now it's, as I mentioned, it's mentioned more often, and we've already come across it in the first significant shift around climate change, that area under the umbrella. So again, it's just simply an emphasis on that. Okay, I'm not saying it's new; it's a stronger emphasis, and we see this in clauses 4.3, 612 again as aspects, and 8.1. So. In 4.3, it talks about the boundaries of applicability within its scope, and then to consider that life cycle perspective. In 612, environmental aspects, there is a new note referring to a life cycle perspective, again, including consideration of the aspects and impacts, which is within this clause anyway, and refers to the products and services at each life cycle stage, which is really important. And I still do talk about that life cycle stage. If I'm looking at someone's aspects register, I'm not just looking at what they've identified for the use of the product. It's, well, the raw material, the manufacturing, all the way through to decommissioning or disposal. So as I said, it's always been there, stronger emphasis. And they do give you a bit of a list, again, which what we said in the first change, of what these life cycle stages are. And again, as we mentioned, they talk about potential emergency situations. And the other newer one is in 8.1. So the new part in 8.1, there's an update to a paragraph. It does refer to externally provided processes, products, or services. So that's where I went into the supply chain side of things. So life cycle and supply chains, because I thought, well, supply chain is part of that life cycle, and the businesses, the other businesses that you can influence, I guess. So, actually, they use that word in the updated paragraph. They talk about control or influence. And then, of course, I like this because I know 9001 also has it. The type and extent of control or influence shall be defined within the environmental management system. So whenever I see that, it's all based on risk, essentially. So, if it has a high risk on what an impact on the company, obviously the type and extent of control or influence is much higher. Okay, if it's a low risk, then your focus, your focus isn't there. It's on your high risk stuff. Does that make sense?
It does. And as you're talking this through, I'm finding it really interesting that, like, to me, as someone, we all know I am not an ISO certification auditor, but I'm finding it really interesting that the way that I have learned and been taught around all of these things is that these additions, particularly the life cycle stage, is something that, to me, has, through you obviously, has become a kind of expected. Like, for me, there is that automatic application. Okay, this is in this standard, and this will kind of interpret this the same way. So I was both surprised and relieved to kind of see it has been added in there, because it does just reinforce the importance of that. I didn't understand why quality had references to it, but environment didn't. And that is so much more relevant, I guess, in my mind. You've got, as you said, the raw materials and the disposal stage, that's taking from the environment in most parts and returning to, or potentially damaging the environment in some parts. So I was really glad to see this is really considered right throughout. But one thing I've picked up in every single standard that you have mentioned there, clause and subclause, relates particularly to, and apologies, I'm getting ahead, documented information. Now, previously in every clause you've mentioned, it was a requirement that the organisation shall maintain documented information. Now it just shall be available as documented information. So my operations manager alarm bells are going off about, hang on, why aren't we maintaining our documented information anymore? Why are we just having it there? That might be picked.
That's a good pickup. Can you look in the annex? Because normally in the annex, they have a little bit about documented information and have an explainer. I know that they do in 9001, because maintain documented information is normally procedures, how to do it. Retain is evidence. And I know there are instances in current revisions where they do say available as documented information. I'm interested to see if they explain what that is, even if you do a search on that term.
That's exactly what I've been doing. And it really, yeah.
There's no explainer
It just
in
seems
here.
that documentation in general, and I'll keep looking through as we're talking through, but it just that through that particular section of the life cycle stage,
Yeah.
which I think is where it's really relevant, because your
Yeah.
life cycle changes and things in that life cycle change. So you do need to be updating that
Yeah.
documented
So
information.
yeah, what does that mean? I might, yeah, I know in the 9001 they do talk about documented information and the meanings of both. Maybe you have to go back to that. And I know it's not 14,001, but just to see whether that is explained. But you're right.
I've now found it.
You have in 14,001.
Yeah, I meant a clause, A3, second paragraph. The meaning of documented information, 2 changes have been made. First phrase, shall be made available as documented information, has replaced maintain documented information, which previously referred to documentation other than records. Second, documentation shall be available as evidence of, replaces retain documented information, which previously referred to records. It's worth noting that this phrase, as evidence of, is not a requirement to meet legal evidentiary requirements. It is intended only to indicate objective evidence to be retained. In the context of documented information, the term available means an organisation can obtain, use, or provide the information to ensure an effective EMS, where it is stated in 4.3 and 5.2 that the information shall be available to interested parties, means those parties may acquire the information from the organisation. And that's everything. So it doesn't really...
So no, that makes sense. So they've replaced maintain documented information with shall be made available as documented information. So maintain documented information meant or means a procedure, how to do it, what people need to be doing. So when we see shall be made available as documented information, it's replacing that, it says, which is not records. Okay. Retain was records. And then they talked about that as well, where you said second documented information shall be available as evidence of. That term replaces retain.
So it's a little...
So they still have the separation of it, but we just need to be aware of the language change here.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a good pickup. It's a bit annoying, to be honest, because we've got, this common high-level structure, which is supposed to have the same terminology, and now all of a sudden this amendment is changing from maintain and retain, which are in all the other standards, and now we've got to know what these different terms mean, unless the other ones are going to be updated.
I was just going to say, I'm restraining myself from jumping straight on the ISO website now and having a look at Annex A, at the high-level structure document. So little that, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But also, I am more keen for that 9001 draft to come out real quick and see what that looks like.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So that's quite possible. Yeah, they're doing a rolling change of the high-level structure or the terminology anyway.
Which was flagged to us a while ago, and we thought,
it was. It was. I have been reading that for a little while. Yeah. Okay. Back on scope, Kelly.
Yeah, back on scope. Back in scope. But oh man, I love the look that I just got then.
Okay. So no, it was good information. So thank you for going outside of scope.
You're welcome. I won't do it again.
So with that second area around life cycle approach, remember how I had the example of the previous sort of what's the term I'm using? So it's now my head's gone blank. It's not a change, it's a shift. That's the word. Yeah, it's a shift. In this example, I use a clothing brand. Okay. And I sort of said, look, it could, with a clothing brand, taking into consideration this life cycle approach, they could ensure their raw materials are sourced sustainably. They could work with suppliers to reduce water and energy consumption during that manufacturing or production. They can create take-back programs for garment recycling. We've all seen those horrific photos of piles and piles of garments. I do want to add, we've got an amazing student, David Baggs, from Global Green Tag, who we have a great corporate relationship with. They send a lot of students on our courses, and David has been around for years, hasn't he, with us?
Yeah. Early adopter.
Yeah, definitely. And he's still a great contributor, to the point where he shared some additional information after he read the newsletter 2 days ago, 1 day ago, can't remember. And I said, look, I'm going to include that in the podcast because it was great timing, and we'll also update it into comments. I think he's come through with another one since, and we'll add both to the comments. Not sure what that looks like on a podcast, but it's within the verbal content anyway. But David said that with regards, and this was specifically to my example with the clothing brand, he said it's very appropriate that these requirements are coming into 14,001. However, I would add for your information that in garment manufacturer example, which is this one, you could, and in future probably should, include independent third-party certifications for health, environment, ethical supply, life cycle assessment, traceability, and manufacturer claim verification, and then a risk assessment as per examples, which would fall under clause 612, which is your environmental aspects. And of course, there's potential actions for manufacturers or suppliers of products to take. So, he's basically saying in that industry, in that garment manufacture world, there's a whole lot more that needs to be considered when we're talking about that life cycle approach. So he's given a whole lot more information there.
He's just got your umbrella and put a poncho over the top of it. So you are completely right from the lifestyle. I love that. Yeah.
So,
because again, a lot of those things are already in other spaces. Traceability is heavy in food. So like, again, impacted and impacts environment. So again,
that's right. Well, traceability is also in quality. 9001.
Yeah.
So, I do think that it's really going to help with this integration across, the 3 standards that I work in, quality, environment, and OH&S. So thank you to David Baggs from Global Green Tag for that additional information and insight into that life cycle requirements specific to that garment manufacturer example. So if you're listening to this, add that to your notes.
Yeah.
Okay. The last one, Kelly?
Yeah, because my favorite word of all is in this. Let's go to the...
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to guess what it is. Okay, the third significant shift that falls under the EMS stormproof model is risk management, and I've put resilience in there as well. So the relevant clauses, again, 4.1's popped up a lot, obviously. We've got a new one, 614 and 615 here, which I think 615 is a new, that's planning action, I think. And then 8.2, which is emergency preparedness and response. So once again, 4.1 is around your context, and we have already shared this one, that they're very specific around which environmental conditions have the potential to be affected with this. So that sort of helps when you go through this process of identifying climate-related risks. Okay, so by going through this process, it's not just about coming up with a list of stuff. Well, these are your risks, your potential risks. Okay, and it should also come up under your compliance obligations too, actually, which is 613. I haven't got that up in front of me, Kelly, as to what, or if there's any changes in 613. I'm having a
There
quick
is.
look
They're just
now.
a replacing of the documented information. That's
Oh,
all
it's
that's
just a
changing in
document
613.
information one. So yeah, it's just changed from maintain to shall be available. So we still need to maintain. I'm going to struggle with that wording. We still need some documentation. Okay. Then the other one, which is 614, which is around risks and opportunities. I think it used to be called planning action. And now they've changed it to risk and opportunities.
Planning action
So
moved to 615. So they've
5.
thrown this in front of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So they've specifically got this risk and opportunities at 614. It's got a new first paragraph as well, which refers to the EMS, includes the scope, but you can see it then talks about determining the risks and opportunities as well. So it's really sort of enhancing again that shift, that emphasis on these risks and opportunities as well. And that means that companies must review, evaluate these risks associated with these environmental changes, and of course don't forget supply chain disruptions. And then, as Kelly said, planning actions is now 615.
Correct.
So that's and that is just that documentation change wording again, I think.
We're now planning. No, we've got a couple of changes. So they've just added tying it back to 612 and 613. And now
that makes sense.
So they've given again more context and a little bit more guidance as to.
I like that.
Yeah, I think that's really good, especially for someone coming in to this standard for the first time. It really helps to see those connections.
It helps with that cycle because it's all well and good to identify this stuff. Well, 6.2 is your objectives, so 7 is your support, 8 is operations, and 9.1 is like your monitoring, measurement, evaluation, or performance evaluation. So now this is, well, okay, what are we doing about it? I do like to see that cycle. So that's great. And then the new addition here, I don't think we've mentioned 8.2 before.
No.
We did mention about identifying potential emergency situations. I think that goes back to clause 612, your environmental aspects. So it's quite specific. So of course, if we've identified our potential emergency situations, in the context of our environmental management system, then of course it's sort of comes into fruition in clause 8.2, where we need to have some plans to manage, respond to any emergency situations, as well as test or conduct drills for those potential emergency situations. So in the environment, these are things like floods, cyclones, which Kelly and I are in southeast Queensland. So we traditionally have always had fairly wild weather during summer, but obviously that has changed even more so in the last couple of years. With the first cyclone in 50 years hitting southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales even. So it's becoming more common and this unusual activity. Fires, of course, it's basically extreme weather events, isn't it?
Yeah, and I love that in this space they are replacing things, but I think here again it's just minor changes I'm finding here. But when I'm reading them again, taking off and what I know hat, the new revisions are much clearer. They definitely simplified the language. I really do, because now it's the processes needed for this shall be available, not they need to do this and have confidence in that. It's not giving you the answers, but it's simplifying.
But more context.
more contents, simpler language.
Yeah, that's a good takeaway. So with this one, and it's the last one, the example I gave was a food manufacturer. So if you're a food manufacturer and taking into consideration this section, which I've covered around risk management, and resilience, I guess, you could identify your potential extreme weather risks, okay, because that impacts your supply chain, so agriculture. Develop some business continuity plans for those disruptions. Ensure those, and this feeds into 8.2, your emergency preparedness and response. So ensure that you do have those emergency response plans or measures in place. Don't forget to test them as well. You don't want to wait until something happens and then find something's not working. So always test them. So yeah, you see, I've added a few points. They might not be the complete list, as David Baggs picked up in the clothing manufacturer, but they're just prompts there for you to think about and prompt the discussion more.
Yeah. And I think anybody listening today will be able to think of immediate examples of all of those things. So we've just talked about how we weren't expecting a cyclone 4 weeks ago. We got one. We are seeing floods in places, central Queensland, that haven't had rain in years, but suddenly are 2 foot deep in mud because they haven't had rain in years. We've just had that earthquake in places that aren't expecting earthquakes. We're having food recalls because of things in places that we're not expecting. Every single one of those umbrella points that you have pointed out, the climate change, then moving into the life cycle, and then that risk management. And Jackie didn't guess my favorite word of all after curiosity.
Yeah, what is it?
Resilience.
Okay, I thought it might, because normally I wouldn't have said it, but I thought, I think I'm going to say this because I think that's your favorite word.
Yeah, because a lot of people think resilience is how we manage things in the moment, and that's not what it is. Resilience is how we learn from that and how we pick up and move on with the next stage and kind of manage that. And I think I'm a little bit disappointed that that's not a word that's included in any ISO standard. But I think that's kind of the end goal of everything, is that any one of these ISO standards is intended to help you and your business and all of your interested parties be more resilient in everything that's happening. So I think this one is big and exciting. And I just stole your thunder on your recap there. I apologize. But yeah, while it is a lot, as we're talking through this, it's not actually a lot. It appears to be a lot. It is some structural improvements, some further alignment, a lot more context and simpler terminology. But I think if you think of it the way that you've done that, it is going to make it a lot less intimidating. 47 pages of changes isn't going to seem so scary.
No, it's actually going to be interesting, because I'm thinking, so if this does remain as an amendment, I'm going to have the original standard, the 2015 revision, and I'm going to have the amendment, and then not trust what I'm reading in the standard and really just to refer to the amendment. Like, it'd be so much easier if it was just a new revision, which at this point, as we discussed earlier, it is not. It's a draft amendment too. However, who knows, after this draft amendment, they might, as Kelly said, get the hint and say, you know what, there should be a new revision. I don't understand why it's not.
And if you want to give them the hint, it does say on the website and at the beginning of the draft amendment, which I'm going to throw in the show notes, a link to the draft amendment. I so do want feedback and comments. So they're asking, let's share our thoughts and feelings and see, what they do.
Well, there is a QR code that you can fill in the feedback form. So
we'll make sure that's available in the show notes as well, all that information, because if we're feeling it.
Sorry, you got until the 28th of April.
Okay. Let's
That's a
share
good
that.
point.
All right, I'm going to hand over
Yep.
to you and we're going to wrap up with the day.
Okay, so to summarize, there was 3 areas that, there was an emphasis on, I felt, and Kelly and I share the different clauses, but there was around the climate change considerations. So there was more context around that because they mentioned emissions, biodiversity, climate related risks, and talking about properly integrating them. They talk about life cycle thinking and the supply chain. So it's about expanding your EMS perspective beyond your own organization's direct operations. So it goes upstream and downstream, I guess, because that's that full life cycle. And that's why I included the supply chain in that. And then, of course, the last section that I thought they strengthened or had a stronger shift or emphasis on was risk management and resilience. So it's about an organization, a business's, I suppose, ability to look ahead, anticipate, and then adapt and respond to these environmental risks and these potential disruptions. It's about being prepared, and that's why one of Kelly's favourite words of resilience is in there. So, as always, before I hand it back to you, Kelly, to close off, don't forget that anyone can follow the standard. Why don't you be the one to lead the standard? And we should have a link to my book that's coming out this year.
It will be in the show notes every week.
Okay, which is all about that. I'm just going to keep checking on you every single week.
We are going to promote the bejeebers out of that. I've been hearing about it for nearly 10 years, and I cannot wait. It will be under my Christmas tree, but hopefully we've got a copy before then. So,
it's a sad Christmas present.
Oh gosh. That is a wrap for another episode of Lead the Standard. Thank you for sticking with us today. It has been a long one, but I think this is one that we really did need to talk out, and I cannot wait to hear and read some of the comments. So please do leave them below. We have talked about all the amendments that apply to 14,001. Well, not all of them, the key ones, and what that means for anyone working in that environmental management space, not just auditors. So Jackie, thank you for bringing those down into 3 categories and giving us a little bit more clarity. I'm not going to share a highlight here because I think I've done that multiple times. I said I'm looking forward to seeing the simplicity of this rollout, and I've just given myself a few action items to look at a couple of other things. But we haven't got into the detail this week because next week we are going to get into a bit of detail on 6.12 environmental aspects right or nothing else, or get environmental aspects right or nothing else works. We've touched on that a few times today. It is a few changes sitting in there, but absolutely positive ones. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. I am very much turning into Jackie. Thank you all for listening. As always, don't forget to subscribe, share this episode, leave us a review. As I said, please, we are really keen for comments this week. So until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep leading the standard. Goodbye for now.
Bye.